Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That's okay, please. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the very last in our American Canadian Studies guest speaker event of the term. And we're ending with a rock and roll power chord. We've got two speakers on American popular music. So we're going to start with Simon Philo from the University of Derby, who is the program leader in American Studies there and writes and researches on American popular music, American popular culture more generally, and has just published hot off the press. There we go. Cue.
Shameless plug.
Cue a message from our sponsor.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you see it. British Invasion, Cross Currents of Musical Influence. So Simon's going to speak about the impact of the Beatles on the United States, and then we'll have perhaps a little bit of a discussion and move on to our second speaker, Randall Stevens, waiting in the wings. He's also be talking about rock music in the United States. So.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, there is a commercial. I have got product out, but there is another reason for flagging this up. This book, British Invasion, Cross Currents of Musical Influence, is part of a series of books published by Roman Littlefield called the Tempo series. And I'm telling you this not because, as I say, I'm shamelessly touting for business, although there is a bit of that, I think. Because this series has a quite specific brief, which has obviously shaped the content of the book and also the voice of that book as well, and hence this talk. Now, Tempo wants its authors to examine music, individual artists, genres, or in this case, moments, in what it calls a cultural historical web of its time, for its time, and in its time, demonstrating then how and why it mattered on a variety of different levels, looking at the inherent exchange, the interplay and conversation between music and culture. Now, of course, I don't have a problem with this, and I'm guessing that it shouldn't be a deal breaker for you either, although I'm sure I'll find out if it is the case. I'm hoping that, like me, you're all ready, willing and able to see and hear popular music as socially constructed, looking to locate its practice, values and meanings in context. To understand popular music, in the words of James Lull, as a form of communication, a sphere of culture that routinely diffuses and amplifies its influence deeply and sensuously into the lives of those who create it, listen to it, use it, and dance to it. So the book tracks the journey of 60s British pop into America, from peripheral irrelevance through exotic novelty to the very heart of the mainstream. It marks and attempts to explain then a distinctive moment, as I mentioned before, in Anglo-American relations as it reflects, comments on, and even helps shape this particular moment, this time. Now, Andrew Blake wasn't by any means the first to identify the 20th as the American century. Gertrude Stein, as I'm sure you're aware, called it as such in the mid-century. In specifically pop musical terms, though, Andrew Blake argues that the century should be characterized by what he calls an overwhelming sonic Americanization. But one way of viewing the invasion, the British invasion, as it was called, might be to see it as a rare instance of exchange that reverses the default flow of goods and ideas. Before 1964, only 2 British acts had ever topped the Billboard singles chart. British bestsellers in America, like Laurie London's 1958 hit, He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, for instance, was such a rarity that they prompted front-page headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. And in 1963, the year immediately before all hell broke loose, things reach an all-time low, with just one UK pop act in the American top 10 all year. But in a dramatic reversal of fortune, an unprecedented total of 32 British singles make the top 10 in 64. And the Beatles, who pretty much were the invasion in the first half of the year anyway, account for 60% of all recorded music sold in America between January and May. And in total have 6 #1 singles in the calendar year. The peak years of the invasion, 64 and 65, saw UK acts occupying the #1 slot for exactly half the time, 52 of 104 weeks. But of course, the numbers that indicate this turnaround in the commercial fortunes of pop music, of British pop music in America, also represent the count-off that propels us into a fuller assessment of the invasion's meaning and import. On a musical level, the invasion is often credited with bringing the curtain down on surf music, pre-Motown vocal girl groups, teen idol pop, and even the folk revival. It's also seen as denting the careers of many, from Elvis down, whilst inspiring others from Bob Dylan down. It cemented the primacy of the rock group and the self-produced and self-written material. It transformed the political economy of music making, leading to a pretty seismic shift in the status and subjectivity of the pop musician. Having played a major part in defining 60s rock then, the invasion helped offer youth new ways to interpret their surroundings, new ways to define their identities. According to Peter Wicker, in the 60s, songs contributed to the making of a new political consciousness. So that singers and songs, he writes, were central to what he calls the cognitive praxis of social movements. If this is the case, then it would not have been possible without the force of the invasion. And whilst Wicker probably didn't have a Hard Day's Night in mind when he wrote those words, or maybe he should have. It was the invasion then that enabled rock music to regain its disruptive power with a joyful vengeance, until by decade's end, at the end of the 60s, it would be seen as a genuine force of cultural and political consequence. So in a sense, it all starts here, in 1964, when that all-important joy really kicks in. So, by the summer of 1964, the Beatles have become the first unmistakably non-American performers in pretty much any mass medium to achieve international superstar status. Of course, key to achieving this status was conquering that American market, an unprecedented feat for a British pop act, as I briefly suggested. When attempting to explain how and why the band managed to do this, some critics have, quite rightly, identified the importance of timing. Being in the right place at exactly the right time to exploit numerous strands of development that were coming together. So it is, for example, that Andre Millard, in his 2012 book Beatlemania, tellingly subtitled Technology, Business and Teen Culture in Cold War America, he's noted how demographics can explain the Beatles' huge sales figure. The driving force of Beatlemania, Millard writes, was the growth of the audience for popular music. By 1964, he tells us, about 40% of all Americans were aged 20 or under. 17-year-olds were the largest age cohort in the US. A lucrative market, he concludes, for a range of consumer goods and services, including records. Yet demographics might help explain soaring sales, but they don't necessarily explain why the Beatles, in particular, should sell so many records to American teens. 60%, as I mentioned before, in that first half of 1964, of all records sold in America were by the Beatles. Clearly, whilst timing cannot be discounted as a factor contributing to their success, it's important to recognise a range of other factors, many specific to the Beatles, that undeniably helped deliver just the right formula, just when it was needed. Although it's perhaps too simplistic to argue that the Beatlemania's real foundation was technological rather than psychological, it is, though, equally pat, of course, to suggest that it was solely the manifestation of American youth's desire and desperate need of the good times that only the Beatles and the Beatles alone could promise and deliver. Indeed, this particular explanation has become, as I'm sure you're aware, a near cliche. So, for the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia, for example, the Beatles supplied a happy flash, like the first good news, he said. Whilst even the normally temperate Ian MacDonald might be perhaps guilty of losing a touch of critical distance when he suggests that their joyous energy, talking about the Beatles, and invention lifted America out of its gloom. Yet a cliche achieves its status as a cliche because presumably it has some basis in at least a, if not the, truth. Sam Smith included, it's evident that there has never been anything quite like Beatlemania, either before or since. And as you already know, I'm keen to view joy as crucial to any understanding of this phenomenon at this point. In his memoir, Come Survey Almost Grown, James Miller writes of the Beatles getting under people's skins, provoking what he calls a collective swoon. With the Beatles, he notes, the public reaction in America was sharp, profound, and enduring, as if a large segment of the population had fallen suddenly and hopelessly in love, perhaps love. The feeling of shared pleasure was that intense. And it's a love affair that, again, I'm sure you're aware, endures, even when us Brits cooled somewhat in the 70s and 80s. Such explanations can run the danger of being rather unobjective and impressionistic, but as I'll hopefully demonstrate, may not be as nebulous as they might first seem. Clearly, this relationship would not have developed in the way it did had it not been for a number of key determining factors. For example, the Beatles could be said to have functioned as a source of generalized relief from Cold War anxieties, as well as some much needed and more specific relief from the collective depression that's commonly believed to have afflicted the nation following Kennedy's assassination in late 63. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to diss Garcia and Donald. And within the context of the stale and empty pop formulas that are often viewed as characterizing American youth music in the early 60s, at a time when it's been well documented rock and roll's originators had been sidelined and pop seemed more self-absorbed than ever and largely driven by fads and crazes, Beatles songs had a power and a passion that was missing in the mainstream, making the band, in Barry Miles' memorable term, Elvis to the power of four. So whilst Millard has concluded that you don't need a degree in sociology or psychology to understand why the Beatles conquered America in '64, all you have to do, he writes, is understand how all the new machines worked in their favour and then do the baby boom math. I would beg to differ. I'm not convinced that math can take care of this one on its own, at least. In fact, a degree in sociology, psychology, history, maybe even American studies might well help explain things more fully. Millard, by his own admission, is not concerned with the music, for example. And as a result, perhaps the study can come across as being somewhat deterministic in stressing demographics and technology and math. But then I suppose we could view those who put Beatles' success in America entirely down to the music, the force of the music, as being equally one-eyed or perhaps one-eared. Because whilst, of course, pop music is both a highly organised and commercially exploitative industry, on the other hand, it can be a rich source of meaning, a field which might provide an arena for creative expression and personal identity. And here I think the story of the Beatles in America in 1964 demonstrates this very effectively. So in the words of George Harrison, the Beatles' first press conference on American soil, let the feasting begin. The Beatles flew into the United States for the first time on February 7th, 1964, with modest ambition and expectation. Of course, with hindsight, perhaps they should have been more bullish about their chances of achieving success in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand had reached number one, after all, on the 17th of January. So in fact, some of that mania started without them. Although America's top 40 stations willingly play their part, the record's success, and indeed all that came after, was not simply attributable to a committed six-figure marketing campaign, although that did represent an unprecedented investment. Since it was clear that American teens genuinely wanted to hear Beatles music. The response was too hysterical to simply put it down to clever marketing. And what's more, they were apparently responding to this music in some very odd ways. Here, there were some obvious parallels with the function, appeal and impact of Beatles' track She Loves You in Britain 6 months or so earlier. Writing of I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Nick Brommel points out that this is not Billie Holiday singing about strange fruit or Ella Fitzgerald singing about love for sale. It's simple to the point of crudity, banal. But this simplicity, Brommel continues, is what begins to explain their appeal and their meaning. Because their simplicity said that innocence has virtue and validity. Their energy claimed that innocence has power. What made the Beatles different, continues Brommel, was the extraordinary intensity with which they fused innocence and instability. Coming on like some kind of She Loves You Part 2 then, I Want to Hold Your Hand communicated the Beatles' explosive exuberance and their attitude with particular effectiveness. Both tracks then packaged their belief, voiced again and again, in the redemptive possibilities of communication, of love. And this played a vital role in the development of that uncanny rapport between the band and their audience. That was a prerequisite, of course, of Beatlemania. As these songs continually look to make connection through explicit contact with you, celebrating the pleasures of getting through, of listening, being heard, telling and touching. Here, redolent of what Tachi has called pop's affective dimension then, in which consumption can be used as a sign of belonging. Many Beatles fans experience Beatlemania as a liberation, an empowerment that grew out of an identification of themselves as a group. And in many cases, which led directly to them being in a group. Guitar sales in America spike and peak between 1964 and 67. And you get thousands of so-called garage bands made in the Beatles' image emerging right across the nation. I Want to Hold Your Hand then was perfectly suited as a calling card for the Beatles in America, capitalizing on the band's outsider status and so evidently lacking the guilt complex that overshadowed the nation and hung there for months after the event. I Want to Hold Your Hand communicated a palpable sense of joy, that's that word again, that might have seemed crass and insensitive for American singers at that point. Although the recovery from feelings of shock and grief in the wake of Kennedy's assassination just 2 months earlier has been acknowledged as being more rapid than would be expected in instances of actual personal loss, it's worth noting that a significant exception to this pattern of rapid recovery was amongst teenagers, as Wolstein's 1965 study, Children and the Death of a President, would confirm. This study highlighted this depth of feeling and intensity of grief that neither diminished nor resolved as quickly as it did amongst this demographic group. This led to Wolstein's not unreasonably concluding that American teenagers had formed a deeper affective bond with Kennedy and so felt the impact of his murder more strongly. In such a context, I Want to Hold Your Hand, though, gave American teens permission to let go, feel how good it is. As their manager Brian Epstein never tired of telling anyone who asked him to explain the Beatles' appeal, they were simply being themselves, a quality that surely accounted for a large measure of their appeal on both sides of the Atlantic, where fans didn't just passively consume Beatlemania as part of a transaction with the capitalist entertainment industry, although it's fair to say, of course, that quite a lot of that did go on. They also integrated it into their life to help define who they were and what they hoped to achieve. Leading by example, because the Beatles presumed to do exactly as they pleased, they extend the same privilege to their fans. Initially via music, typically perceived and received, first in Britain, then in the States, as loud, fresh, and different. In the words of one high-profile American fan, poet Allen Ginsberg no less, the Beatles changed American consciousness. They introduced a new note of complete masculinity, allied with complete tenderness and vulnerability. And when that note, Ginsberg said, was accepted in America, it did more than anything or anyone to prepare us for some kind of open-minded, open-hearted relationship with each other and the rest of the world. As Ginsberg called it, the Beatles initiated and encouraged nothing less than a change in what it meant to be a young man. For him, songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand were primers for a new sexual politics. Something similar, perhaps, in terms of the Beatles' impact and usage and possible realignment of gender role is confirmed in Ehrenreich, Hess and Jacobs' study called Girls Just Want to Have Fun, 1992, in which they conclude Beatlemania to be the first and most dramatic uprising of women's sexual revolution. Catalysed more assertive behaviour, because the female Beatle fan could turn passivity into aggression, actively and loudly pursuing the object of her sexual fantasies rather than vice versa. Not only did the Beatles sound fresh to American ears, I should have had that, should let you absorb that one actually. There we go. They looked fresh to American eyes. When they first stepped from the plane onto American soil in February '64, they were decked out in stylish, smart, but singly unusual suits, black ties on white shirts, three-quarter length, dark A-line raincoats, Cuban-heeled boots, and of course mop-top haircuts. The Beatles had a startling effect on American dress and attitude, and the two were connected. We were new, Lennon crowed in triumph years later. When we got here, you were all walking around in fucking Bermuda shorts with Boston crew cuts and stuff on your teeth. However, televised press conferences, newspaper articles and photographs, publicity stills and record sleeves could only achieve so much as far as exposing America to this alien look and attitude. The primary objective of their short promotional visit to America in February '64, of course, was their live television appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show on consecutive Sunday evenings, performances that would both galvanise their teen appeal and make them a genuinely pan-generational phenomenon. In the event, nearly 74 million viewers, or a third of the total population, tuned in to that first appearance. Up to that point, this represented the largest television audience in history, symbolically dwarfing the estimated 60 million who'd watched Elvis Presley when he first appeared on the same programme. These TV appearances were undoubtedly the high point of the band's first triumphant visit to the States, constituting, as Michael Gilmore puts it, a moment of pure, true, meaningful history, as the nation, or at least a third of it, received its first heavy dose of pure-grade Beatlemania. At the end of the show, host Sullivan read out a congratulatory telegram purportedly from Elvis Presley, but actually penned by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, which seemed to mark the passage from one rock and roll era to another. Yet the significance of that moment, as Gilmore has suggested, transcended the level of musical turf wars. Much like their first movie would later in the year, these early US TV appearances helped seal the deal, in crucially allowing the Beatles to be both seen and heard. So 2 days after their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, the Beatles attended a party at the British Embassy in Washington. And here, Lyndon Johnson is reported to have said to the British Prime Minister, "I like your advance party, but they need a haircut." British invasion was underway, and even the president knew it. Now, a fan club poll conducted in the first flush of stateside Beatlemania revealed that the typical fan of the group was a 13 to 17-year-old white female middle-class Christian B-grade student with a personal radio. Unsurprisingly, it was not a gay bearded poet in his late 30s. And it's true that while subsequent tours in 65 and 6 would see more males in attendance, audiences for the Beatles' first American tour in the summer of 64 were indeed overwhelmingly female in composition, and teen, of course. However, even at this early stage, it was also clear that the band's fan base was widening at pace, drawing in more males, more non-teens, and maybe even more beat poets on a daily basis. Of course, television appearances had helped in this, but it was the movie A Hard Day's Night that represented the single most important driver for the expansion of the Beatles' constituency, cementing the band's status as global superstars in the process. It allowed for massive new audiences to experience Beatlemania. A Hard Day's Night, which incorporated the movie, the soundtrack album, the related artwork, and was also supported by that high summer tour I mentioned, which coincided with its release, was the distillation not of only all the Beatles meant at that point, but arguably what they would come to mean. It showcased, for example, their ability to keep several steps ahead of the game, to innovate and extend that important meaning of joy, meaning of pop, whilst taking the massive fan base with them along for that journey. Across each media platform, it highlighted their ability to be two contradictory things at the same time. In McDonald's nice, tidy assessment, comfortably safe and exhilaratingly strange. On vinyl and celluloid, the Beatles were irreverent but never dangerous. They hinted at rebellion, but played it for its humour rather than as a biting critique of the establishment. Blimey. Is that a rapture? As their publicist Derek Taylor perceptively noted, they turned on millions of adolescents. But the young, he said, never did want it raw, so they absorbed it through what he described as the Beatle filter. With A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles opened up the mainstream to a whole new world of creative adventure, but to a degree and at a pace that would not risk alienating their fans. In the first few years of their recording career, Beatles music was consistently described by critics and fans alike as fresh and exciting, rather than alien and offensive, offering, in Ian Chambers' memorable phrase, an altered perspective, not a foreign landscape. Listening to the Beatles in 1964, Grail Marcus has recalled how the music struck him as simultaneously, instantly recognisable, and like nothing we had ever heard. It was joyous, Marcus says, threatening, absurd, arrogant, innocent, tough. Qualities and contradictions effectively bottled for mass consumption. A Hard Day's Night honed the paradox to perfection, marking the moment at which the Beatles had not just entered, but also rearranged the mainstream, opening it up to countless other outsiders and insurgents in the process. Now, the soundtrack album was released in the States in June '64, a few weeks before the movie premiered. Although there's a critical consensus which has identified only modest evolution in and across early Beatles albums, Hard Day's Night represented a pretty substantive forward leap. Whether in its UK or US guise, and up until the release of Sgt. Pepper, Beatles LPs were often marked by considerable variations in their transatlantic track listing, the album was comprised entirely of the band's own compositions. And this was something earlier Beatles albums had not offered, and was almost as shocking a proposition to the American music business as it was to their British counterparts. The album was also notable for its use of 4-track recording, although the rudimentary studio facilities available to the Beatles on their earlier records had proved a source of strength in approximating the band's pulsating live performances, and so, of course, maximising that joy. 4 tracks reduced the margin of error by allowing for greater flexibility in the recording and mixing of the vocal and instrumental tracks. On A Hard Day's Night, it also allowed for the use of something called overdubbing, a process which thickened the band's sound by layering instrumental and vocal textures. And it also encouraged a use of greater a greater range of instrumentation. In addition to the standard beat group guitar and drums, Hard Day's Night featured the acoustic guitar, 12-string electric guitar, a variety of percussion instruments. For example, the Latinate And I Love Her featured claves and bongos, the piano, organ, and even some orchestration. Although noteworthy for its deployment of the Rickenbacker 12-string, A Hard Day's Night can be said to have heralded the arrival of folk rock. The album was, though, arguably and audibly more relaxed, as perhaps befits a record that was often viewed or has been viewed as a document of the Beatles' recent discovery of Dylan, whom they'd yet to meet in person, but were fans of his music nevertheless. Lennon in particular was apparently taken with Dylan, and whilst Dylan's influence cannot necessarily be heard lyrically, it was certainly traceable, discernible in both the music and the introspective, intimate mood of many tracks on an album dominated by Lennon compositions. The most memorable single song, however, of course, was the album's title track, which reached number 1 on Billboard on the 1st of August 1964. As Robert Sandell describes it, the magnificent drang announced with no little grandeur the Beatles' ambition to take beat music to places it hadn't been before. It begins with a huge chiming chord, a sound more resonant, more electric, and more, well, guitar-y than anything previously heard on disc. God alone knew what that chord was, Sandell says, G11th suspended fourths not having featured prominently in the work of Chuck Berry or Carl Perkins. Though initially wary, the ever-astute George Martin, the Beatles' producer, recognised the appropriateness of what he called the song's instant combustion. To this day, Martin says, somewhat disingenuously, I still don't know what that chord was, but it was a very good one. And it set the tone for the song and the whole film, because we knew, Martin says, that what was going to follow was going to be dramatic, wonderful, funny, exciting, and everything else. Now, anticipating easy profit, Hollywood studio United Artists had offered the Beatles the chance to make a movie as early as October 1963. At this time, the studio was interested in the Beatles where the band's American record label Capitol weren't, because it had had a production office in London since 1961. And so United Artists was well aware of the group's phenomenal success in their home territory. For United Artists, A Hard Day's Night represented, though, an opportunist punt in a foreign novelty market that could prove, hopefully would prove, fabulously lucrative. Well, just as the music had done, so the movie packaged the Beatles as gentle revolutionaries. For whilst cleverly satirising the pretensions of teen television and the fashion industry, A Hard Day's Night still maintains the basic conventions, the template of the teen movie, in which carefree young heroes overcome the anxieties and hypocrisy of the older generation. Here, though, was yet another instance of the Beatles offering their growing army of fans an altered perspective rather than a foreign landscape. Because although A Hard Day's Night was recognisably a teen movie, all was not quite as it seemed. As its scriptwriter Alan Owen was at pains to point out, we're not going to have a story that ends up at the Palladium with the vicar smiling and giving the thumbs up sign from the stalls. Nothing like that. So just how much of a departure was it? Well, in the Village Voice review from Andrew Sarris, for example, he went so far as to call it the Citizen Kane of jukebox musicals. And I'll just leave that hanging there for a while. Comfortably safe, yet exhilaratingly strange. As I've already suggested, United Artists wanted the movie to be made quickly and cheaply, to cash in on the Beatles' phenomenal intercontinental success, which they were nevertheless convinced was a moment that would soon pass. In the early 60s, a typical Hollywood feature would cost around $1.5 million. Hard Day's Night came in at approximately £180,000, with the Beatles paid a modest 25 grand between them. Its much lauded break with the glossy look of the standard teen movie then was the product of both a conscious strategy and stringent budgeting. Exactly the same drivers that had combined to such startling effect on those early Beatles records. Thus, whilst the decision to film in grainy mock-doc monochrome was one dictated primarily by budget, it turned a good little movie into a genre masterpiece because, as Paul McCartney observed, it just seemed harder, more artsy. We liked all that stuff. On one level, Hard Day's Night could be viewed for what it evidently was, for its backers at the very least, a quick, cheap pop cash-in with a real back-of-an-envelope plot. Yet although the British rock writer Charles Shaar Murray has pointed out there's no boozing, shagging or drugging in the movie, the Beatles smoke a lot of ciggies, cheat at cards and lech after a posse of schoolgirls. They also, he continued, relentlessly mock the stuffy, the southern, the bourgeoisie, each other, especially poor old Ringo, their minders and small-minded pettiness in all its manifestations. For Murray, the movie had an obvious political edge, but one which might well suggest a culturally specific use value confined to British youth and its struggles. But there was plenty to suggest that the movie's apparently parochial concerns played out just as powerfully with American youth in that context. For one thing, just like those early records, the movie glows with an infectious, invincible optimism, a joy that appeared to have a quantifiable impact. More so than any single Beatles track, single album, or even single televised performance, countless American musicians and filmmakers and artists have reported the movie's life-changing effect, inspiring them to pursue their dreams, to light out, Huck Finn style, down their own path and ignore doubting voices. The words of David Crosby, for instance, attest to both the band's cultural power and the vital hypodermic function A Hard Day's Night performed in dosing it. I knew right then what my life was going to be, he recalled. I wanted to do that. I loved the attitude and the fun of it. There was sex. There was joy. There was everything I wanted out of life. Those earlier Ed Sullivan Show appearances had, of course, sparked similar desires, confirming that the Beatles' impact was not just confined to the arena of passive teen consumption, but perhaps could signpost a route to some on which they were no longer to be mere passengers. A Hard Day's Night delivered this in a much more sustained and concerted fashion to a much wider catchment. Because ironically, in the summer of 1964, the Beatles existed in no more fully realised form than on screen. And so, through the movie filter, this presence, this ubiquity, enabled them to effectively communicate their meaning on both sides of the Atlantic. As James Miller points out, in a country like England, where the prospects of young people had long been circumscribed by caste and class, Beatlemania was anything but banal. As Richard Lester put it, the movie's director, the Beatles sent the class thing sky high. They laughed it out of existence. In the US, on the other hand, the band's impact was different, but no less significant. In America, the prospects of young people, Miller points out, had long been circumscribed, not by class, but by an open-hearted eagerness to want whatever one was supposed to want, to do whatever one was supposed to do, to be just like everyone else. In America, it was this timid conformism, as he describes it, that the Beatles laughed out of existence. Richard Lester, the director of the movie, had moved to London nearly 10 years before, keeping company with Britain's preeminent comedy team, the Goons, and working on various TV shows. In 1962, he directed a budget B teen movie called It's Trad, Dad. Although in many respects a bog-standard teen pick, It's Trad, Dad featured some cleverly done musical sequences and perhaps unexpected touches of satire and surrealism. These preempt Hard Day's Night and demonstrate Lester's affinity with anarchic comedy. On A Hard Day's Night, Lester broke with the conventional long-take tendency to experiment with faster, flashier editing, fracturing musical numbers into discontinuous shots, employing zany technique derived from, it has been said, French New Wave, TV commercials, and of course British eccentric comedy, as we will see in a minute. In arguably its most positive review, Andrew Sarris, he of the Citizen Kane reference, which I'm sure you've not forgotten, characterised the movie as a brilliant crystallisation of such diverse cultural particles as the pop movie, rock and roll, he was really on one, wasn't he, when he did this? Cinema verite, the Nouvelle Vague, free cinema, the effectively handheld camera, frenzied cutting, the cult of the sexless adolescent, the semi-documentary and studied spontaneity. Now, leading into the Beatles movie project, Lester's directorial resume included this movie here, the running, jumping and standing still film. A 10-minute short 1960, filmed over 2 weekends at a total cost of just £70. Devised by the comic actor Peter Sellers, featuring Sellers and amongst others Spike Milligan in various wordless sketches, most of which were shot al fresco in English countryside. An absurd and surreal homage to silent comedy, it was reportedly one of Lennon's favourite films and earned cult status both in Britain and America, where it received an Academy Award nomination for Best Short Film. And not only did the running, jumping and standing still film feature some of the personnel who would go on to work on A Hard Day's Night, behind and in front of camera, there were also stylistic similarities between the two, particularly in terms of some of the sight gags and the editing. Well, Lester was also clearly influenced by the documentary tradition and in particular by British free cinema. The British free cinema movement produces a number of short films in the second half of the 50s, which drew on techniques of documentary realism. And with his sincere and unpatronising appreciation of the Beatles, Richard Lester shared in the free cinema's directorial empathy for its subjects. Mama Don't Allow and We Are Lambeth Boys were representative of personal filmmaking, committed to the dignity of the individual and the significance of the everyday, often with an unabashed provincial gaze and featuring British youth smoking, talking, flirting and dancing in clubs and pubs. Exactly the kind of activities, of course, the Beatles would engage with and take great delight in A Hard Day's Night. We Are the Lambeth Boys was directed, as you can see, by Carol Rice and shot in characteristic verite style. This 50-minute documentary offered a sympathetic take then on young working class life in South London, in which the teenagers featured were allowed to speak for themselves, expressing their aspirations, their dreams, their frustrations and fears via a combination of internal monologue, conversations with each other and via direct interview. And it was particularly noticeable how the monotony of their working lives was pointedly contrasted throughout with the release achieved through the teen rituals of dancing and drinking and courting. So I mentioned a bit earlier, A Hard Day's Night was scripted by Alan Owen, a Liverpool native who had written for the popular British TV cop show Z-Cars. Owen was charged with producing credible dialogue, and he had researched this by trailing the Beatles on a typically short, typically frenetic tour of Ireland in November 1963, where he witnesses at first hand not only the claustrophobic room and car nature of their existence, but also importantly, how each member of the group dealt with each other, but also with that existence. Contrary to the impression given by lines that came across as natural and unforced, though, there wasn't that much improvisation going on in the movie. The Beatles didn't have the time or the inclination necessarily to exert a great deal of influence on that script. But equally, as we know, they had no intention of making fools of themselves. Or maybe they did. And were keen to avoid the embarrassing contrivances of the typical teen movie. Rock and roll films, said McCartney, were traditionally bad vehicles. So we had this idea it would be great to be in something that was actually a decent film and had music. So whilst what Andrew Sarris described as the razor-slashing wit deployed throughout was actually largely the result of the scriptwriter Alan Owen, exploiting Scouse slang, for example, that in many cases the Beatles themselves did not use in real life. The band still sounded, and so came across as, credibly young and northern. And throughout the course of the movie, of course, they punctured class pretension and the older generation's hypocrisy. Indeed, A Hard Day's Night unfolded as a series of confrontational encounters based on the overlapping themes of North and South, youth and age, and class. The first of these confrontations occurs as the band makes its way on a train down to London and clashes with an irate city gent, a collision of class, geography and generation based on something that each Beatle had experienced, which Owen had then incorporated into his screenplay. And it was very often the case that in highlighting the tension between old and young, middle and working class, the Beatles deployed their own language, and particularly humour, to resolve things in their favour. As this bowler-hatted gent attempts to enforce his rules, shutting the window the lads would prefer left open, commanding Ringo, poor old Ringo, to turn off his transistor radio, the Beatles use both words and deeds to register their resistance. When the city type mobilises his war service to simultaneously assert his rights and deny those of the Beatles, Ringo delivers the sarcastic one-liner, "I bet you're sorry you won." Whilst Lennon's response to this lecture is to simply flutter his imaginary eyelashes and ask the gent to give us a kiss. As Arthur Schlesinger noted in Show, the movie revelled in its presentation of, there's a quote up there, a conspiracy of delinquency against pomposity. This particular sequence ends, of course, surreally with the Beatles running alongside the carriage, banging on the compartment window, mugging and shouting at the older passenger like 4 8-year-olds. "Hey, mister, can we have our ball back?" Enacting a distinctive brand of delinquency, which drew much of its energy and power from the simple pleasure of being childish and childlike. So, just as it had been in other formats, and just as Epstein and Martin had recognised right from the get-go, the strategy of being themselves was central to the success of A Hard Day's Night. This is a project that had in fact started out life as a documentary, provisionally to be entitled Beatlemania, an idea that was quickly shelved, yet even as a fiction it had little of the artifice or commercialism of the rock and roll films that preceded it. It was also palpably different because of the impression that this was a faithful and privileged look at the Beatles' real lives. The mock-doc approach enabled much of this to shine through as we focus on the Beatles as prisoners of their success, or in producer Walter Shenson's words, convicts in transit, and how they cope with this. Hopefully this will work. I'll show you this clip. Yeah.
mister.
So the movie's most acclaimed scene enacted a variation of similar set pieces from the running, jumping, standing still film, and represented a moment of goonish, unconditional release, a literal escape from a succession of tight, restrictive spaces that have hemmed the Beatles in: train compartments, low-ceiling corridors, crowded hotel lobbies, and backstage stairwells. Andrew Sarris described what you've just seen as one of the most exhilarating expressions of high spirits I have ever seen on screen. With the cry of "We're out" and to the strains of "Can't Buy Me Love," the band invade the playing field with the same elemental joy and vitality with which they just invaded the barren field of British, and now of course American, popular music. Throughout the hard day's night, relief and its concomitant possibility of transcendence has come most explicitly via musical sequences and interludes, of which this is perhaps the prime example. In Revolution in the Head, Ian MacDonald has written perceptibly of the Beatles suffusing the Western world with a sense of rejuvenating freedom, comparable to the joy of being let out of school early on a sunny afternoon. As the breakout scene demonstrated, no single text, certainly not in '64 at any rate, so comprehensively and graphically bottled this joy as a hard day's night. In this, it was genuinely era-defining, for it demonstrated that the joy was to be most effectively communicated by the kind of kinetic charge which would help shape the very meaning of the times for many people. 60s, as David Pachacka has called it, may have said no to everything including itself, but the greatest no of all was to stasis. It was motion and change, constant change, change now, that made the 60s as heady and terrifying as they were. The Beatles broke through and down pop convention to sound real and fresh. Significantly, in A Hard Day's Night, they not only sounded real and fresh, but looked and so behaved this way too. In the words of the movie's respected director of photography, Gilbert Taylor, we disturbed people to some extent, didn't we? By the end of '64, the Beatles had sold an estimated 25 million records in America. According to the ever-skeptical Michael Kelly in his book, The Beatle Myth, it was at this point that the newness of the invasion had certainly worn off, and the groups were no longer a novelty. And whilst he may have had a point in suggesting that by year-end the invasion was no longer a novelty, its effects had by no means worn off. In fact, in the words of the Carpenters, we'd only just begun. Tellingly, even the self-professed mythbuster Kelly has had to concede that perhaps the most important legacy of the invasion was that for the first time, the suits at record companies, television executives and adults in general finally took rock and roll seriously. And if it was the Beatles-led invasion that persuaded adults in general to take rock and roll seriously, then an obsession with chart placings as a measure of its significance should not be allowed to obscure the full extent of its transformative power. As later chapters of the book set out to prove, I mentioned that I've got a book out, the Beatles had a key role to play in not only presaging, but also shaping what was to come, so far as rock music's contribution to the counterculture was concerned. Jonathan Gould is spot on, of course, when he points out that apart from the proliferation of Ringo for President badges, there was little perceived connection between the portentous events of '64 and the sound of pop music. And that in the US, the notion that Beatlemania might have social or cultural implications that reached beyond the ephemera of a teen craze remained far from most people's minds. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Academic careers, of course, are built on it. But these implications should have occurred to more at the time, perhaps, as they apparently struck our hero, Andrew Sarris, when he concluded his movie review by declaring that the Beatles are a sly bunch of anti-establishment anarchists, but they are too slick to tip their hand to the authorities. Convincing the sceptical of this function then and now may well be problematic, because direct links between lyrics and current events are not that easy to find in Beatles songs from any stage of their career and recording life, let alone early doors in '64. Instead, perhaps it was a case of music and lyrics together constructing, as Arthur Marwick suggests, constantly changing moods, which never failed, it seemed, to evoke responses in large numbers of listeners. And whilst there were numerous movements, of course, for change underway and causing considerable friction, especially in the second half of the 60s, coalescing around civil rights, the Vietnam War, feminism and environmental issues, with generational tension that played a vital role in each of these. Roy Schuker has defined the counterculture as a loose, expressive social movement, an integrative label for various groups and ideologies present, but most importantly seen, he says, as a generational unit, the youth culture, challenging traditional concepts of career, education and morality, and seeking an identity outside an occupational role or family. Hard Day's Night carried this challenge and activated the search. So although no one knew what would take the place of the old order in the summer of '64, because maybe this wasn't being openly or widely discussed, the sound that seemed to pave the way for it was the music of the early Beatles. In this way, perhaps Hard Day's Night's combustible opening chord was as portentous as the snare shot on Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, simultaneously tolling the end of something and heralding the start of something else. It might be a stretch then to claim A Hard Day's Night to be a countercultural movie. It's clearly no Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, or even Magical Mystery Tour. Yet equally, mobilizing Schuker's definition of counterculture, it's possible to see how and why A Hard Day's Night might well have possessed more than an anticipatory flavouring of the movement. Predictably, the movie is most commonly understood, of course, as a primer in Beatlemania. However, it was a primer of potentially greater import, as many young fans reportedly experienced it as a liberation, an empowerment, a promise of freedom, bringing feelings of belonging as well as longing. Responses that perhaps bring it in line with that Peter Wicker quote on rock's political charge I referenced a couple of hours ago. It presented the Beatles as careless and carefree, without respect for age or experience, interested in only the thrills, desires and disappointments of the present, a message that resonated powerfully with American youth. It reinforced the imperative to live now for this moment, the total commitment to nowness that could very well sit at the heart of any attempt to grasp the meaning of that loosely defined counterculture. We're almost there. In their sheer ubiquity via both music that expressed the quality of always becoming, and by constantly changing themselves, the Beatles did more than any one single artistic entity at that time to confirm the sense that the world was radically unstable and open to new possibilities. They were amazing people, recalled the actor Victor Spinetti, who played the tetchy TV director in A Hard Day's Night. And they were curious. They wanted to learn. In Nick Brommel's view, revolutionary music delivers life as something fresh and anarchic from the grip of the past, habit, convention. When music makes people feel this way, he continues, I think it's fair to call it revolutionary music. The cultural power wielded by the Beatles in '64 at least resided squarely in its fearless indifference to ridicule, to what other people thought about you, which could be variously seen and heard, of course, in the shaking of their mop tops, in the yeah, yeah, yeahs, in the distinctive tailoring, in the gurning and high jinks and Lennon's invitation to the city gent on the train to give us a kiss, and maybe in those outrageous chord progressions singled out by Bob Dylan. More graphically, in A Hard Day's Night, acting for adolescents everywhere, they seized and made a world, taking power and space away from adults and adult control, in the process demonstrating what Brommel identifies as the force of an impulse that would drive young people just a few years later to seize university buildings and claim the streets, perhaps. Sorry we hurt your field, mister, Harrison says at the end of the clip you've just viewed. Now, I can't be entirely sure, us being in the realm of imprecise rebellion, and that incident is my get out in the questions, but somehow I don't really think he means it. After all, he did call his hairdo Arthur. Thank you. Sorry. I've gone on like a progressive rock record.
There's no time for an encore. So well, maybe we've got time just for a couple of remarks or responses. I mean, I might first invite our second speaker, before we can introduce Randall Stevens, who also has an interest in the Beatles in America, to maybe...
Yeah, we were having a chat about
I guess
66.
as somebody who's just thrown my Beatle wig into the ring of Beatleology, I'm really interested in these, this moment in time, especially in 1964 in America, as a kind of, maybe a period because it's a sort of a monoculture, a time when something like this couldn't happen before. But I wanted to ask you a question about the Beatles and the sort of transatlantic element to see what you think about this. But, is it the case that the Beatles were kind of holding a mirror to America of artists that had sort of been forgotten, or because of fate, the consequences, like Elvis, being drafted into the army, Little Richard going into the ministry, Chuck Berry violating the Mann Act and going to prison, Buddy Holly dying in a plane crash. But these are such important figures for the Beatles. Is it that the Beatles are kind of reinterpreting American music in a way for an American audience, and also a British audience? Or is that kind of overstating the case?
Well, I mean, you're not saying that, and I don't think it's necessarily Colts to Newcastle. Not even the Animals were doing that, but it's not that kind of thing. But I think I think what also drives their fusion of those different musical influences, because it's not just one of those. I mean, they were big Buddy Holly fans. They were inspired by Buddy Holly, particularly, but also they were Chuck Berry fans, and they were also very fans of early Motown, etc., etc. One of the things that kind of drives them, I suppose, is one of the things that drives the creation of beat music, and that is that kind of almost a kind of punk DIY ethos, and the things that drove punk in the 70s. Often it's argued, you could see driving the creation of beat music in the UK. It's coming out of skiffle, for example, which is really important in their formative years. Taking all those things together and kind of working in a particular context where beat music is being well received, and partly because American rock is perceived to have got so flat. I mean, there's this great quote from I think Bobby Darin, who comes over to tour in Britain, and he says, "I'm never coming back again," because the fans were just too damn crazy for and they were just too noisy, and because they were kind of conditioned now to beat music and the kind of sonic attack of beat music. And Beatles were very much part of that, obviously, because they were kind of leaders that spearheaded that. So it's not a case, and again, you weren't saying that, it's not a case of simply kind of sending the music back. It is perhaps in that fusion, but also in adding something that is of England, if you like, or of Britain, or of Liverpool, or whatever it might be, and putting that into the mix as well.
I mean, in some ways, it seems to me like it bears some comparison to ska and reggae, of these groups in the Caribbean trying to do Motown, but then it coming out as something else because of all these other fusions.
Absolutely, these were bands like the Beatles itself that they would have, those pre-Motown vocal girl Motown groups. They were Beatles favourites, and the Beatles tried to kind of almost in some ways replicate their sound, but without having the range of instrumentation, for example. So it would have to be a case that it's just the guitars and the drums that would kind of recreate almost that sound. So they would have to find a way of negotiating their love of that music and their attempt not only to recreate, but that was a big part of it, and recreate that music with the limited range of instrumentation that they actually had, and that kind of sort of boiling it all down basically to that basic attack of guitar and drums. They didn't have the instrumentation, the range at that point. So I think